Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. The topic that they voted for was backups, and considering that this one got more votes than all the alternatives put together, it's safe to say that this is a topic on a lot of people's minds. So first up, what is a backup? And there are actually two kinds of backups that are defined by Magic's policy documents. A simple backup undoes just the last action completed or the one currently in progress in the game, with the intention of making a fix smoother or easier to perform. In contrast, the other type of backup reverses every action that's happened in the game up to the point of the error. The intention here is to undo the error that happened and then proceed from a corrected game state as though the error never happened. There isn't really an official name for this type of backup, but to avoid confusion, I'll refer to this as a full backup in this video. Now, in a regular rel, or indeed a kitchen table setting, backups can happen whenever a judge deems it appropriate. But in a competitive rel environment, whether a backup is appropriate is a little bit more rigidly defined. The overarching philosophy is spelled out pretty well in this line from the IPG. A good backup will result in a situation where the gained information makes no difference and the line of play remains the same, excepting the error which has been fixed. Of course, this is not always possible, and the judge must weigh the disruption caused to the game state by the error and the disruption caused by backing up, and evaluate which of these would get the game closer to a state that would have existed if no error had ever been committed. Technically, there's no cap on how complex or how many actions a full backup might involve, but in practice, most judges are pretty conservative. It's unlikely that a judge would elect to back up more than a few game actions in total unless the situation was really dire. Because determining the degree of disruption to the game state involves, judgment on the part of the judge, officially, only the head judge is allowed to authorize a backup. In practice, it's very common that the head judge will take advantage of this line, saying that they can delegate that role to team leads also. One aspect of this that's pretty easy to overlook is that backups involving unknown or random elements are generally very discouraged. For example, consider if Amy has a fetch land in play and Nick ends his turn, and then Amy casts a lightning bolt at the end of Nick's turn. After Amy draws, the players realize that she did not have an untapped red source. While backing up would otherwise be pretty simple here, consider that Amy would have to put a random card from her hand back on top of her library if we were to do that. If Amy doesn't want to draw the card that she put back, then she can crack the fetch land and replace it with a random card. This obviously represents a pretty big departure from the correct game state, and so factors like this can alter the decision to back up, basically single-handedly. With that said, let's consider some cases where a judge might consider a backup, and talk about what aspects of the game might sway that decision one way or another. For our first example question, Amy controls Dark Confidant, and she draws a card for the turn, and then she realizes that she forgot the Dark Confidant trigger and calls for a judge. Would you back up? And the correct answer here is no. See, this is a case of a missed trigger, and backing up is not a supported remedy for missed triggers. For this missed trigger, the opponent would get the choice of whether to put the triggered ability on the stack, and if so, it's put on the stack right now. Not all missed triggers are handled the same way, so if you're interested, I'll refer you to one of my other videos on the topic of missed triggers. There is one thing that I need to bring up, though, which is that a relatively recent change related to this part of policy. It turns out that there is one specific case where missed triggers do have a backup as part of their supported remedy. Let's say that Amy has a Chalice of the Void with one counter on it. She plays a lightning bolt against Nick's Grizzly Bears, and then Nick puts the bear into his graveyard, and Amy does likewise with her spell. Amy then realizes that her bolt should have been countered and calls for a judge. This situation is handled very similarly. Nick, the opponent of the person who should have remembered this trigger, gets to choose whether it gets put onto the stack, and if it does, it gets put onto the stack right now. Well, that's a little unsatisfying, huh? After all, if the trigger would counter the lightning bolt, but it's too late for that to happen, so really Nick doesn't have any choice at all here, does he? And so, in cases like this, where a player has just committed an action that indicates the trigger has been missed, and that action would change the effect of the trigger, a simple backup may be performed on that action. So the judge could back up the resolution of the lightning bolt, putting the bear back onto the battlefield and the bolt back onto the stack, before putting the Chalice of the Void trigger onto the stack. This line would not be applicable to the previous situation with the Dark Confidant trigger, because while drawing for the turn does indeed indicate that the trigger has been missed, it does not change the effect of that trigger. The Dark Confidant trigger will still do the exact same thing, albeit to a different card when it resolves. Meanwhile, with the Chalice example, putting the trigger onto the stack changed whether the ability did anything at all. Another thing to note is that policy only permits attempting a simple backup in cases like this, not a full backup. If Amy had, for example, played a land or done some other game actions after resolving the bull, it's unlikely that a judge would be willing to back those up in order to put the chalice trigger back on the stack. Okay, so next up, let's consider this one. Amy activates a rummaging goblin, except that she draws a card first and then discards a card. Would you back up? How? Alright, so with this one, the appropriate infraction is hidden card error. That's because the first thing Amy did that was against the rules is draw a card. The correct order would be to discard first. Because Amy did not do that, there is no publicly verifiable way to confirm Amy is discarding a card that she had in her hand when she activated Rummaging Goblin. Amy still does have to discard a card, but to be fair, her choice should be restricted to the same number of cards that she would have had in her hand when that choice was supposed to happen. In cases where the infraction was immediately followed by moving a card from the affected set to a known location, such as by discarding, putting cards on top of the library, or playing a land, a simple backup to the point just after the error may be performed. Therefore, the judge could back up the discard by returning that card to Amy's hand, and then perform the normal hidden card error fix by revealing her hand and setting aside a card of her opponent's choice. Amy would then discard, followed by drawing the card that was just set aside. Okay, how about this? Amy plays a Path to Exile against Nick's Grizzly Bears. Nick exiles the bear, but he doesn't search, and Amy doesn't say anything about that. Nick then untaps, draws for the turn, and plays land. At this point, he looks at Amy's graveyard and asks her what card she just played. Amy said it was a path, and Nick replies, well, I thought it was a prismatic end. In that case, I should have searched. Judge, do you back up here, and how? Alright, so if you look at Path to Exile, you can see that searching for a basic land is indeed optional, and you only shuffle if you do search. Now, there are legitimate reasons why Nick might decline to search. For example, if he's scryed and doesn't want to mess up the top card of his library, or maybe he knows that there's no basics left to find and he just wants to save some time. But Amy cannot assume that Nick is turning down this opportunity. She needs to seek confirmation that Nick is making a choice with no visible impact, rather than just not doing anything because he doesn't realize Amy's spell gives him that right. Because Amy did not fulfill her obligations for communication and Nick made a decision based on that, the correct infraction is a communication policy violation. In such cases, the judge may consider a backup to the point where the player made a decision affected by the bad communication. In this case, that would be for when Nick didn't search for a land. Note that this is a full backup, not a simple one, meaning that even though multiple things have happened in the game since that point, the judge can still allow a backup up to the point of the action that was inspired by the incorrect information. Now, speaking of communication, did you know that there's actually a way to back up that does not involve a player committing an infraction? If a judge gives incorrect information to a player and that player makes a decision influenced by that information, a backup to the point where they acted could be considered. For example, if a player asked a judge whether killing an Archangel of Strife with its trigger on the stack would prevent the damage, and the judge said it would, and then the player did this, it would be possible, by which I mean policy supported, to back up to undo the casting of the removal spell. The IPG provides for a full backup in this case, so some other number of game actions after that could also be undone if necessary. The standard is the same as any other full backup, though. The judge needs to believe that the game state, if we left the case as is further from the game state that would exist without the error than the game state that the players would reach if we did this backup. After a certain number of turns or game actions have been completed, leaving the game state as it is would be less disruptive, as much as the judge might regret being personally responsible for this issue. And for those of you who have been keeping track at home, you'll know that there's one infraction left that has a backup among its supported fixes. And I've left this one for last because it's the biggest and the most common situation for a backup to occur. I'm of course talking about a game rule violation. Anytime someone does something that is breaking a rule in the comprehensive rules, including not following a spell or ability's instructions correctly, and it doesn't cleanly fit into one of the other infractions that we have, you're dealing with a GRV. With its status as somewhat of a catch-all infraction, it's no wonder that this one requires the most flexible and, being honest with ourselves, the most complicated procedure for fixing it. If you remember way back at the beginning of the episode, there was an example where a player cast a spell that required mana of a color that player did not have untapped. This is a very common situation to come up in a real game, and if it's caught right away, backing up is usually a great fix. The more actions that have happened since the error happened, though, the worse the fix becomes. And as we saw, some factors about the game state, such as a fetch land, can affect this too. In the case of a game rule violation, a simple backup is the preferred solution. If that is not sufficient to get back to the point of the error, then there's a list of specific types of issues that have bespoke fixes specified. If none of those are applicable, then the last possibility is to choose between either leaving the game state as it is or performing a full backup to the point of the error. Let's practice by looking at a few game rule violations and discussing whether a backup would be a good solution. Amy attacks with grizzly bears and Nick blocks with a hill giant. Amy then plays a giant growth on the bear. At this point, Nick realizes Amy controls a crazed goblin and that also should have attacked. Would you back up? And the answer here is no. If we took the giant growth out of the equation, I would say this would be a slam dunk to perform a backup. But with the giant growth, though, backing up is a lot less appealing. Nick now knows about a combat trick in Amy's hand. Even if that didn't change his ultimate decision, we know it definitely would have at least affected his decision making when it comes to how he should block. How about this? Amy plays a meddling mage but forgets to name a card with it. After Amy attacks with 2 grizzly bears, Nick blocks and kills one of them and then goes down 2 life. In Amy's second main phase, she realizes that she never named a card. Would you back up here? And it turns out that we don't have to. A permanent like meddling mage being on the battlefield with no card named for it is one of the game rule violations that has a specific fix defined for it. In this case, that would be for Amy to name a card immediately. If this rule didn't exist, I think this would still be a good candidate for a backup. No spells were played during the combat, so it's unlikely that either player would change how they played. It is true that Amy now knows Nick doesn't intend to play anything, so maybe that means she's less likely to name a combat trick than she normally would be, but it's also unlikely that Amy would forget to name a card with a pre-combat meddling mage if that was a significant factor in her original game plan without the error. Last one, and I think this is also a pretty interesting one, Amy plays a Brainstorm by tapping Scrubland. Her only other land is a Flooded Strand. After resolving the Brainstorm, she realizes that she could not have tapped for blue. Would you back up here? And in order to answer that, let's take a look at what our 2 options would be. If we leave the game state as is, Amy's turn 2 was massively more productive than it likely would have been otherwise. If we back up, that would consist of putting the 2 cards back from Amy's top of her library into her hand, and then putting 3 cards chosen at random from Amy's hand on top of her library, and then returning the Brainstorm Amy played to her hand and untapping the Scrubland, which is also very disruptive to the game, even before we consider that Amy has a fetch land to shuffle away her top cards of her library at any point during the next 3 turns. Neither one of these is a very good option. In other words, neither one of them is very close to the game state that would exist if there was no error. But I would say that leaving the game state as it is would at least be the less bad alternative. This is a case where a lot of factors in the game might move my decision one way or the other. And that's the biggest thing that makes it extra difficult to make a video about backing up. There are so many ways that the game could evolve that make firm, unqualified statements about what would or would not be a good candidate for a backup. It becomes very difficult. For example, for all of the examples that I presented here, there are relatively minor differences that I could easily have introduced that would have changed my opinions. And yeah, opinions is really the right word to use here because given that the decision involves personal judgment on behalf of the judge, it's very rare for a situation to come up in a practical game that 100% of judges would all give the same answer for. With this video, you have an overview of all the ways backups might come up, as well as the considerations that a judge would have when deciding whether one is appropriate. And I hope that this framework proves useful to you in your own games. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.